The year 1988 in Brazil was marked by significant socio-economic upheaval as the nation navigated its transition from a period of military dictatorship. This era was characterized by considerable economic turbulence, including hyperinflation that eroded purchasing power and created widespread instability. High rates of unemployment further exacerbated the difficulties faced by ordinary Brazilians, contributing to an overall poor economic climate. This challenging economic landscape also had a knock-on effect on other sectors, including healthcare, where the rising cost of living made access to essential medical attention difficult for many families. The pervasive economic crisis created an environment where desperation and resentment could easily take root, potentially influencing individuals to consider extreme actions in response to their hardships. Against this backdrop of national economic strain, on September 29, 1988, VISP Flight 375, en route from Porto Velho to Rio de Janeiro with scheduled stopovers, became the stage for an audacious and alarming event. The flight, operated by a Boeing 737-300, was carrying 98 passengers and 7 crew members when it was hijacked. The perpetrator's aim was nothing less than to crash the aircraft into the Planalto Palace in Brasilia, the seat of Brazil's executive power, with the intent of assassinating the then President of the Republic, José Sarney. This act, driven by deep-seated grievances against the government, represented a direct assault on the very symbol of political authority in Brazil. This research script aims to provide a comprehensive and in-depth analysis of the hijacking of VASP Flight 375. It will meticulously explore the biography and background of the hijacker, the precise timeline and geographical context of the event, the characteristics of the firearm used, the evolution of the hijacker's demands and underlying motivations, the experiences of the flight crew, particularly the heroic actions of the pilot, the media coverage and public reaction to the crisis, the negotiations that took place between the hijacker and the authorities, the tragic death of the first officer, the circumstances surrounding the hijacker's demise, the psychological impact on the survivors of this traumatic event, and the broader societal ramifications of the hijacking within Brazil. By examining these facets, this report seeks to offer a detailed, factual, and analytical account of this significant historical incident and its lasting implications. The individual behind the hijacking of VASP Flight 375 was Raimundo Nonato Alves de Conceição. At the time of the incident, Conceição was 28 years old and worked as a tractor driver. He hailed from a poor family background, a detail that underscores the potential for his vulnerability to the economic hardships gripping Brazil in 1988. His profession as a tractor driver suggests a working-class individual whose livelihood was likely tied to the agricultural sector, an area that could have been significantly affected by the prevailing economic downturn, potentially leading to instability and job insecurity. A critical catalyst for Conceição's desperate act was his recent job loss. This unemployment was directly attributed to the devastating economic crisis that plagued Brazil during that period. Conceição himself expressed feeling weary of the lack of jobs and opportunities available for his family, indicating a profound sense of frustration and concern for their future. The direct correlation between his unemployment and the national economic crisis highlights the personal toll of broader societal issues, likely intensifying his feelings of anger and desperation towards those he perceived as responsible for his plight. Conceição's mental state leading up to the hijacking appears to have been characterized by extreme frustration and anger. He held President José Sarney directly responsible for the dire economic situation facing the country and for his own job loss. This conviction fueled his decision to take drastic action, aiming to punish the president in a highly symbolic and destructive manner. His ultimate goal was to crash the hijacked Boeing 737 into the Planalto Palace, a plan that strongly suggests either a suicidal intention or a willingness to sacrifice his own life in what he may have perceived as a necessary act of protest or retribution. His actions stemmed from a deep dissatisfaction with the overall situation in Brazil, indicating a profound sense of grievance that manifested in an extraordinarily violent and targeted manner. The hijacking of VASP Flight 375 occurred on September 29, 1988. The flight originated from Confins International Airport, located in Belo Horizonte, Brazil, departing at 10:42 a.m. Belo Horizonte was the third stopover for Flight 375, which had begun its journey in Porto Velho, with a prior stop in Brasilia, and was en route to its final destination of Rio de Janeiro. A significant factor that enabled Conceição to carry out his plan was the notably lax security protocols prevalent at several airports within Brazil's interior at the time, including Belo Horizonte. Baggage checks were practically non-existent, and metal detectors were not in use, allowing Conceição to easily board the aircraft with a concealed .32 caliber revolver. This lack of stringent security measures at the airport proved to be a critical vulnerability that the hijacker exploited. Approximately 20 minutes after takeoff at 10:52 a.m., while VASP Flight 375 was within Rio de Janeiro's airspace, Raimundo Nonato Alves da Conceição stood up and announced that the flight was being hijacked. He immediately declared his intention to enter the cockpit. The timing of this announcement, shortly after the plane had become airborne and was well into its scheduled route, suggests a deliberate choice aimed at maximizing his control over the situation and minimizing the immediate possibility of intervention. Conceição's demand was that the aircraft be diverted to Brasilia. His ultimate and politically charged objective was to crash the plane into the Palácio do Planalto, the headquarters of the Brazilian government and the official workplace of the president. However, due to the skillful actions and negotiations of the pilot, Captain Fernando Murilo de Lima e Silva, the aircraft ultimately made a forced landing at Santa Genoveva Airport in Goiânia at 1:45 p.m. This diversion was achieved after the pilot successfully convinced Conceição that his initial plan to reach the Planalto Palace was logistically impossible due to factors such as thick cloud cover, low visibility, and the aircraft's limited fuel supply. The pilot's quick thinking and persuasive abilities were therefore instrumental in preventing the catastrophic outcome that Conceição had intended for Brasilia. At 10:42 a.m., VASP Flight 375, a Boeing 737-300 with the registration PPSNT, took off from Confins International Airport in Belo Horizonte, carrying 98 passengers and 7 crew members. Approximately 10 minutes into the flight, at 10:52 a.m., while the aircraft was flying within Rio de Janeiro's airspace, Raimundo Nonato Alves da Conceição announced the hijacking. He immediately made an attempt to gain access to the cockpit. Flight attendant Ronaldo Dias noticed Conceição's unusual behavior and approached him. In response, Conceição fired his .32 caliber revolver, grazing Ronaldo's ear. Conceição then proceeded to fire at the cockpit door, and one of the bullets struck an extra crew member, Gilberto Renhe, in the leg, causing an injury. First Officer Salvador Evangelista, upon hearing the gunfire, requested that Captain Fernando Murilo de Lima e Silva open the cockpit door to stop the violence, and the captain granted permission. Conceição then entered the cockpit and informed the pilots that he was now in control of the aircraft, demanding an immediate diversion to Brasilia. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, Captain Murilo utilized the aircraft's transponder to transmit the code 7500, which is the internationally recognized signal for unlawful interference or hijacking. As First Officer Evangelista attempted to respond to a radio call from Brazil's Integrated Air Defense and Air Traffic Control Center, SINDACTA, Conceição tragically shot him in the back of the head, resulting in his immediate death. This act of violence underscored the extreme danger and the hijacker's lethal intent. With the first officer deceased, Conceição pointed the revolver at Captain Murilo, reiterating his demand to be flown to Brasilia with the intention of crashing the plane into the Palácio do Planalto. Captain Murilo, fully aware of the hijacker's suicidal plan and facing imminent danger, initiated a high-stakes negotiation process. He skillfully argued that reaching the Planalto Palace was impossible due to significant cloud cover, poor visibility conditions, and the critically low level of fuel on board. After several minutes of dialogue, Conceição conceded that crashing into the palace might not be feasible. However, he remained adamant that Captain Murilo should not land the aircraft in Brasilia or at the Anápolis Air Force Base, despite the rapidly dwindling fuel supply. Given the perilous fuel situation, Captain Murilo suggested diverting to Goiânia, and after further discussion, Conceição agreed to this change of plan. As the aircraft approached Goiânia, Captain Murilo executed two daring and unprecedented acrobatic maneuvers, a complete 360-degree roll known as a tonneau and an intentional spin. These maneuvers were so extreme that they were witnessed by the pilot of a Brazilian Air Force Mirage 3 fighter jet that had been monitoring the situation. The second maneuver proved successful in destabilizing Conceição within the cockpit. Utilizing this brief moment of disorientation, Captain Murilo managed to safely land the Boeing 737 at Santa Genoveva Airport in Goiânia at 1:45 p.m., with the aircraft's fuel tanks nearing complete depletion. Once on the ground in Goiânia, the hijacking incident transitioned into a prolonged standoff and negotiation process that lasted for several more hours. The Boeing 737 was quickly surrounded by a significant presence of military personnel from the Army and agents of the federal police. During this time, Conceição made a new demand. He requested a smaller aircraft, specifically an Embraer EMB 110, with sufficient fuel to continue his plan, insisting that he would be the one to pilot it. Captain Fernando Murilo, demonstrating remarkable courage, agreed to risk his own life in exchange for the safe release of the remaining passengers and crew members. They then waited for approximately 5 hours until the Brazilian Air Force was able to arrange for the requested Embraer EMB 110 to meet Conceição's demands. Finally, around 7 p.m., Conceição made his exit from the Boeing 737. In a tense and dangerous move, he used Captain Fernando Murilo as a human shield as he descended the aircraft's flight ladder. Moments after they emerged, a federal police sniper who had been positioned to monitor the situation fired 3 shots at Raimundo Nonato Alves da Conceição. Although struck by the bullets, Conceição managed to fire his revolver one last time, hitting Captain Murilo in the leg. Fortunately, Captain Murilo was able to quickly run and take cover. With the hijacker neutralized, the operation concluded, bringing the long and harrowing ordeal of VASP Flight 375 to an end. Raimundo Nonato Alves de Conceição utilized a .32 caliber revolver during the hijacking of VASP Flight 375. The .32 ACP, or automatic Colt pistol round, commonly associated with such revolvers, typically features a bullet mass ranging from 60 to 75 grains, with velocities varying between 925 and 1,150 feet per second, resulting in an energy output of approximately 123 to 220 foot-pounds. For example, a common 71 grain full metal jacket, or FMJ .32 ACP round, can achieve a velocity of around 984 feet per second, delivering about 158 foot-pounds of energy. The stopping power of the .32 ACP is a subject of debate among firearm experts. While some consider it to have marginal stopping power compared to larger calibers like the 9mm or .45 ACP, others argue that it can indeed be lethal, especially with accurate shot placement. The .32 ACP does offer greater velocity and energy than the older .32 S&W round, which was popular for pocket revolvers around the time of the .32 ACP's development. In terms of bullet type, FMJ rounds in .32 ACP generally tend to penetrate deeper than jacketed hollow point or JHP rounds, which may expand upon impact but lose velocity and penetration. Considering the confined environment of an aircraft cabin, particularly the cockpit, the close-range nature of the encounters would have amplified the potential lethality of the .32 caliber revolver. In such a setting, even a round with moderate stopping power can inflict serious or fatal injuries if it strikes a vital area. Furthermore, bullets fired within the enclosed space of an aircraft can potentially ricochet off cabin surfaces, as was noted in the Pan Am Flight 73 hijacking. The tragic death of First Officer Salvador Evangelista who was fatally shot in the back of the head with this firearm, starkly illustrates the lethal capability of the .32 caliber revolver in this context. Historically, handguns chambered in .32 ACP have seen widespread use by both military and police forces across the globe. Its compact size, lightweight, and relatively low recoil have also made it a popular choice for concealed carry among civilians. The accessibility and commonality of the .32 caliber firearm at the time of the VASP Flight 375 hijacking may have been a contributing factor in Consecau's decision to use it. Raimundo Nonato Alves de Consecau's initial and overriding demand was to crash VASP Flight 375 into the Planalto Palace in Brasilia, with the express intention of killing President José Sarney. This primary motivation stemmed from his deeply held belief that President Sarney was responsible for the severe economic crisis that had gripped Brazil and had directly led to Consecau's own unemployment. This initial demand reveals a politically charged act of extreme protest, suggesting a profound sense of desperation and a desire for a highly symbolic and destructive act of retribution against the individual he held accountable for his suffering and the nation's woes. The intent to commit what would have been a suicide attack on the very seat of political power in Brazil underscores the depth of his anger and his belief that such a drastic action was necessary to address the country's pervasive problems. However, as the hijacking unfolded, and after Captain Fernando Murilo de Lima e Silva skillfully negotiated with Consecau, the hijackers' demands began to evolve. The pilot successfully convinced Consecau that his initial plan to reach the Planalto Palace was not feasible due to logistical limitations, specifically the aircraft's limited fuel capacity and adverse weather conditions including thick clouds and low visibility. Following this, Consecau shifted his primary demand. He requested a smaller aircraft identified as an Embraer EMB-110 with sufficient fuel to continue with his plan, stipulating that he himself would remain in control as the pilot. This significant change in his demand suggests a possible reconsideration of his initial suicidal objective, or a realization of its impracticality given the circumstances. It could also indicate a desire to escape the immediate situation in Goiânia and potentially continue his protest, or make further demands from a position of relative safety and control. Several factors could have contributed to this shift in Consecau's motivations. The prolonged standoff and the successful landing in Goiânia might have triggered a survival instinct, leading him to prioritize escape over the initial suicidal mission. Furthermore, the pilot's influence and negotiation tactics likely played a crucial role in shaping Consecau's evolving demands, perhaps offering him a perceived alternative that seemed more attainable. The hijacker's insistence on piloting the smaller plane suggests a desire to maintain control over his situation and potentially use the aircraft to further his agenda. Ultimately, Consecau's motivations appear to have been complex and subject to change under the intense pressure of the hijacking and the unfolding events. His final act of using Captain Murilo as a human shield while exiting the aircraft demonstrates a continued awareness of the danger he faced from law enforcement and a desperate attempt to ensure his own safety during what he likely anticipated would be a confrontation. This act underscores the high stakes of the final moments and the hijacker's understanding of the imminent threat he faced. Captain Fernando Murilo de Lima e Silva was the pilot in command of VASP Flight 375 during the harrowing hijacking incident. Interestingly, the investigation following the hijacking did not disclose specific details regarding Captain Murilo's prior flying experience. Despite this lack of publicly available information about his background, his actions throughout the crisis were nothing short of extraordinary, suggesting a remarkable ability to maintain composure and make critical decisions under immense pressure. During the unfolding hijacking, Captain Murilo demonstrated exceptional leadership and bravery. Initially, he authorized the opening of the cockpit door in an attempt to halt the gunfire that had erupted in the cabin. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, he promptly used the aircraft's transponder to signal the hijacking to air traffic control. Faced with Conceicão's demand to crash the plane into the Planalto Palace, Captain Murillo engaged in a perilous negotiation, skillfully persuading the hijacker that this objective was not achievable due to logistical constraints. When the fuel situation became critical, it was Captain Murillo who suggested diverting the flight to Goiânia, a proposal that Conceicão eventually accepted. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Captain Murillo's actions was his execution of two unprecedented and highly risky acrobatic maneuvers, a tonneau and a spin, as the aircraft approached Goiânia. These maneuvers, though later met with some objection from authorities, were instrumental in destabilizing the hijacker within the cockpit, ultimately leading to a safe landing. Throughout the prolonged standoff in Goiânia, Captain Murillo continued to play a crucial role, even agreeing to Conceicão's demand for a smaller plane in exchange for the release of the remaining passengers and crew. In the final moments of the crisis, he was tragically used as a human shield by Conceicão as they exited the aircraft. During the final confrontation with law enforcement, Captain Murillo sustained a gunshot wound to the leg when Conceicão fired his revolver. Following the incident, he received medical treatment and was hospitalized in Goiânia, but was soon discharged. In recognition of his extraordinary bravery and the fact that he saved the lives of 104 people on board, Captain Murilo de Lima e Silva was widely hailed as a national hero in Brazil. His courageous actions were formally acknowledged in 2001 when he was awarded the Order of Aeronautical Merit and the Santos Dumont Merit Medal. Despite his pivotal role in averting a national tragedy, it is noteworthy that the primary target of the attack, President José Sarney, never personally contacted Captain Murillo, neither speaking to him nor even making a phone call to acknowledge his heroism. Captain Fernando Murilo de Lima e Silva passed away on August 26, 2020, at the age of 76 due to respiratory failure, leaving behind a legacy of exceptional courage and selflessness in the face of extreme adversity. Specific details regarding the extent of live television coverage of the VASP Flight 375 hijacking are not provided within the available snippets. However, given the highly dramatic nature of the event, which involved an attempt to attack the President of the Republic and the Presidential Palace, it is almost certain that the hijacking garnered significant and widespread media attention across Brazil. News outlets would have played a critical role in disseminating information to the public as the events unfolded, reporting on the hijackers' demands, the tense standoff, and the courageous actions undertaken by the flight crew, particularly Captain Fernando Murilo de Lima e Silva. The information conveyed by the media would have undoubtedly shaped the public's understanding and perception of the crisis as it developed. The immediate and subsequent public reaction in Brazil was overwhelmingly one of admiration and gratitude towards Captain Fernando Murilo de Lima e Silva, who was widely celebrated as a national hero for his bravery and the lives he saved. The public was likely gripped by shock and concern as the news of the hijacking attempt and the intended target of the presidential palace became known, recognizing the potential for a catastrophic tragedy. The fact that the hijacker was able to board the aircraft with a concealed weapon due to the lax security measures at Belo Horizonte Airport would have likely sparked public discussions and debates regarding the adequacy of airport security protocols in Brazil at the time. Furthermore, the incident, driven by Conceicão's profound dissatisfaction with the country's economic situation and his personal job loss, may have also initiated broader national conversations about the underlying socio-economic conditions and the levels of economic inequality that could potentially drive an individual to such extreme and violent measures. In essence, the public reaction to the hijacking of VASP Flight 375 likely encompassed a range of emotions, including fear and anxiety during the crisis, profound admiration for the pilot's heroism in averting a greater disaster, and a subsequent period of reflection on the systemic issues within Brazilian society that may have contributed to the event. Captain Fernando Murilo de Lima e Silva emerged as a central figure during the negotiations that took place in Goiânia following the forced landing. He acted as a crucial intermediary, relaying information and demands between the hijacker, Raimundo Nonato Alves da Conceição, and the authorities on the ground. The primary law enforcement agency directly involved in managing the standoff and ultimately executing the final operation was the Brazil Federal Police. Additionally, the Brazilian Air Force played a significant logistical role by arranging for the smaller Embraer EMB 110 aircraft that Conceição had demanded as part of his revised escape plan. Despite the prolonged negotiations that extended for several hours, a peaceful resolution was not achieved. A key factor contributing to this failure was Conceição's persistent demand to pilot a plane himself as a condition of his escape. This demand posed a significant security risk that the authorities were likely unwilling to concede. They would have been understandably hesitant to provide an individual who had already demonstrated a willingness to commit extreme violence with control over another aircraft, fearing the potential for further acts of terror or another hijacking incident. As the standoff continued without a mutually acceptable solution, the authorities may have reached a point where they deemed further negotiation to be futile or excessively dangerous, potentially increasing the risk to the remaining hostages and the public. The ultimate decision to deploy lethal force against Conceição suggests that the authorities perceived an imminent threat, or that a critical breakdown in trust had occurred, leaving them with no other viable options to resolve the crisis. Conceição's unwavering insistence on piloting the escape plane appears to have been a pivotal point that led to the breakdown of negotiations and ultimately sealed his fate. This non-negotiable demand likely made it impossible for the authorities to guarantee public safety while allowing the hijacker to escape, leading to the tragic final confrontation. The death of First Officer Salvador Evangelista was a tragic and pivotal moment during the hijacking of VASP Flight 375. The shooting occurred shortly after Raimundo Nonato Alves da Conceição gained entry into the cockpit and declared that he was in control of the aircraft. At this point, Captain Fernando Murilo de Lima e Silva had already used the transponder to signal that the flight had been hijacked. As First Officer Evangelista attempted to respond to a radio call from Sindacta, Brazil's air traffic control, Conceição suddenly and violently shot him in the back of the head. The gunshot resulted in the immediate death of First Officer Evangelista, making him the only fatality directly caused by the hijacker's actions during the flight itself. The available information from the snippets does not suggest any conflicting accounts regarding the circumstances of First Officer Evangelista's death. The sequence of events appears to be consistently reported across the various sources. The immediate aftermath of First Officer Evangelista's death underscored the extreme danger that the crew and passengers were facing. His killing demonstrated the hijacker's willingness to use lethal force to achieve his objectives and created a climate of fear and uncertainty on board the aircraft. In the long term, the tragedy had a significant impact on First Officer Evangelista's family. His daughter later revealed that they did not receive any substantial financial compensation in the immediate aftermath of the hijacking, and that the legal proceedings related to the case remained entangled within the Brazilian justice system for over 2 decades. It was not until 2011, more than 20 years after the incident, that Infraero, the Brazilian airport management company, was ordered by a court to pay compensation to his daughter, Wendy Evangelista. This compensation was specifically related to the acknowledged lack of adequate baggage inspection procedures at Belo Horizonte Airport, which had allowed Conceição to board the flight with a weapon. The prolonged struggle for compensation highlights potential shortcomings in the systems designed to support victims and their families in Brazil following such traumatic events, particularly in the context of aviation security failures. The hijacking of VASP Flight 375 came to an end with the death of the perpetrator, Raimundo Nonato Alves da Conceição. After hours of tense negotiations following the forced landing in Goiânia, and as Conceição exited the aircraft using Captain Fernando Murilo de Lima e Silva as a human shield, he was shot 3 times by a sniper from the Brazil Federal Police. This final confrontation occurred around 7 p.m. Although he fell after being shot, Conceição managed to fire his revolver once more, hitting Captain Murilo in the leg before the pilot could take cover. Conceição was subsequently taken to a hospital for treatment of his gunshot wounds. However, his death occurred unexpectedly just 2 days later, which led to initial speculation and rumors. Some theories suggested that he might have been given a lethal injection while in the hospital, either by the police or hospital staff. To address these concerns, an official coroner's report was conducted by Fortunato Badan Palares. The coroner's findings determined that the cause of Conceição's death was sickle cell disease, a pre-existing medical condition that was entirely unrelated to the gunshot wounds he had sustained during the confrontation with the police. This official explanation, while perhaps surprising, clarified the circumstances surrounding his death and refuted the earlier speculations. With Conceição's death, the hijacking of VASP Flight 375 was officially declared over. The initial suspicion surrounding his death underscores a potential level of public distrust in official accounts following high-profile and violent incidents. The coroner's definitive report, however, provided an unexpected but clear explanation for his demise.